Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941, 6:47 a.m. The smoke was still rising from the harbor, black columns reaching into the morning sky like the fingers of dead men clawing upward. In a cramped basement office beneath the headquarters building at Station Hypo, a 32-year-old cryptanalyst named Joseph Rochefort sat at a desk covered in papers, staring at a single line of intercepted Japanese radio traffic that made no sense whatsoever. The line read, "AF short of water." Just 5 characters. AF short of water. Around him, chaos. Officers running, telephones ringing. The entire Pacific Fleet was burning half a mile away, and nobody knew if more Japanese carriers were coming. Nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew anything. But Rochefort was staring at those 5 characters because his brain, his strange, exhausting, impossible brain, had just made a connection that shouldn't have been possible. A connection between a message intercepted 3 months ago that he shouldn't have been able to remember, and this message right now. And that connection was telling him something that would change the entire course of the Pacific War. AF short of water. He knew what AF meant. He knew where the Japanese were going to strike next. And he knew exactly how to prove it, using a trick so simple, so audacious, that when he proposed it to his superiors, they would think he had lost his mind. This is the story of Joseph Rochefort and the impossible memory that broke the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code and won the Battle of Midway before a single shot was fired. To understand how one man's brain could change history, you have to understand what that brain could do, and more importantly, what it couldn't stop doing. Joseph John Rochefort was born in 1900 in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a railroad worker who drank too much and a mother who worked as a seamstress to keep the family fed. He was a quiet kid, not particularly social, but he had something that his teachers noticed immediately and didn't know what to do with. He remembered everything, not just important things. Everything. If you told young Joe Rochefort a phone number, he would remember it 6 months later. If you showed him a page of text, he could recite it back to you word for word the next day. If you played him a piece of music, he could hum every note weeks afterward. His teachers thought he was gifted. His mother thought he was blessed. Joe thought he was cursed because his brain wouldn't shut up. While other kids could forget their homework, or forget a bad day, or forget an embarrassment, Joe's brain kept perfect records of everything, filing it away in vast interconnected archives that he could access but couldn't delete. And the older he got, the more crowded those archives became. He described it later as living in a library where every book was always open and you could hear all of them whispering at once. He learned to cope. He learned to focus. He learned to use the curse as a tool. When World War I ended before he could enlist, Rochefort took the exam for the Naval Academy and scored perfectly on the written sections. Every answer pulled from textbooks he'd read once and remembered forever. He graduated Annapolis in 1925, served on destroyers for 3 years, and then, in 1929, the Navy did something that would accidentally create the most dangerous cryptanalyst in history. They sent him to Japan to study Japanese language and culture for 3 years. Living in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932, Rochefort did what the Navy asked. He learned Japanese. He studied their military traditions. He attended their cultural events. But what the Navy didn't understand was what happened when you gave a man with perfect recall access to a language as complex as Japanese. Japanese isn't just vocabulary and grammar. It's context and culture, and thousands of subtle variations in how you say things depending on who you are and who you're talking to. Most students learn by memorization and practice. Rochefort learned by absorption. He would hear a phrase once, and it would be filed permanently, complete with the context of who said it and how they said it, and what the social situation was. By the time he left Japan in 1932, Rochefort didn't just speak Japanese. He thought in Japanese. He dreamed in Japanese. His brain had built a complete parallel processing system that understood not just the words, but the mind behind the words. The Navy brought him back and assigned him to cryptanalysis, break-in codes and ciphers for naval intelligence, and they discovered very quickly that Rochefort was unnaturally good at it. Most codebreakers work methodically. They try different mathematical approaches. They look for patterns. They test hypotheses. Rochefort did all of that. But he also did something else, something that other cryptanalysts couldn't do and couldn't understand. He remembered every single message they intercepted. Completely. Permanently. If someone said, "Show me message 2847 from last August," other cryptanalysts would need to dig through files. Rochefort would just recite it from memory, and not just the message, but the context, the time it was sent, the frequency it was on, the probable sender, and how it connected to 17 other messages that seemed unrelated until you saw them all together. His brain was doing pattern recognition across thousands of messages simultaneously, finding connections that shouldn't have been findable, and by 1941, he was running Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit, in Hawaii, and he was breaking Japanese codes that the Japanese Navy believed were mathematically unbreakable. The Japanese Navy's main operational code was called JN25, a complex cipher system that encrypted messages using a code book of 45,000 five-digit groups, combined with a cipher additive that changed regularly. It was sophisticated. It was secure. And Rochefort's team at Hypo had been steadily breaking pieces of it for months, reading fragments of Japanese communications, building a partial picture of their operations. But they weren't reading everything. They were reading maybe 10%, maybe 15% on a good day. And the problem was that 10% wasn't enough. You'd see fragments. Ship movement here. Supply requisition there. A reference to an operation somewhere. But you couldn't see the whole picture. You couldn't predict what the Japanese were planning. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and everything changed because suddenly 10% wasn't good enough. The Navy needed answers. They needed to know where the Japanese carriers were and where they were going next and how to stop them before they hit again. Rochefort and his team worked 18-hour days, intercepting every Japanese transmission they could capture, trying to break more of the code, trying to read more messages. And in early May 1942, they started seeing references to an upcoming operation, a big one, something the Japanese were calling Operation MI. The messages mentioned a target, a place they were going to invade and occupy, but they didn't use the actual name of the place. They used a code designator, AF. The messages said things like, transport group to depart for AF on June 4th, air attack on AF scheduled for June 5th, occupation force to secure AF. The entire Japanese combined fleet was mobilizing for an attack on AF, and Rochefort had to figure out where AF was before the Japanese got there. and he had to do it fast because the intercepts indicated the attack was coming in early June, just weeks away. Most of the cryptanalysts at Navy headquarters in Washington thought AF was the Aleutian Islands, Alaska. It made strategic sense. The Japanese had been probing American defenses in the North Pacific. It was isolated. It was weakly defended. Admiral King's staff in Washington wrote up assessments saying that the Aleutians were the obvious target and that the Pacific Fleet should position itself accordingly. But Rochefort looked at those 5 characters, AF short of water, and his impossible brain made a connection that no one else made. 3 months earlier, in February 1942, Station Hypo had intercepted a routine Japanese message, the kind of message that most people would file and forget. A boring administrative communication about water supplies at various Japanese-held bases. The message had mentioned that the base at Kwajalein was short of fresh water and was requesting a water transport. That message had used a different code designator for Kwajalein, not AF, but a different 2-letter combination. But Rochefort remembered the message completely, remembered the date and the context and the phrasing. And when he saw AF, short of water, his brain immediately connected the 2 messages, not because of the code designators, but because of the phrasing. Because the Japanese officer who wrote the AF message had used the exact same grammatical construction, the exact same turn of phrase, the exact same formal military style as the Kwajalein message. And Rochefort's brain, with its complete library of every Japanese message ever intercepted, recognized the pattern. It was the same author, same officer, same administrative style. And that meant AF was probably a base with similar characteristics to Kwajalein, a small island with limited fresh water supplies, not a large landmass like the Aleutians. Rochefort pulled out maps. He looked at every island in the Pacific that matched the profile. Small, strategically important, limited fresh water. And one island jumped out, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It had an airfield. It had a seaplane base. It was the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific, and it had very limited fresh water supplies. Everything depended on catching rainwater and distillation. If you wanted to stage a major operation from Midway, you'd need to bring in water. AF, short of water. Rochefort was convinced. AF was Midway. The Japanese were going to attack Midway Island with their entire fleet, probably trying to draw out the American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. But Rochefort couldn't prove it. Washington didn't believe him. His analysis was based on a memory of a message from 3 months ago and a similarity in phrasing that only he could detect. It sounded like madness. Admiral King's staff in Washington sent messages saying that Rochefort was wrong, that he was seeing patterns that didn't exist, that AF was clearly the Aleutians, and that Hypo should stop wasting time on wild theories. This is the moment the story pivots. This is the do-or-die moment where Rochefort had to do something dramatic to prove he was right, and what he did was so clever, so audacious, that it would become legendary in the intelligence community. He was going to trick the Japanese into confirming his theory. He was going to make them tell him that AF was Midway. Rochefort called his boss, Admiral Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and proposed something that had never been done before. He said we need to send a message to Midway, an unencrypted message that the Japanese will intercept, and we need to have Midway report a fake equipment problem that's specific and unusual enough that the Japanese will report it up their chain of command. And if they report it using the code designator AF, then we'll know AF is Midway. Nimitz looked at him for a long moment, then said, "What kind of fake problem?" Rochefort said, "Water. We tell Midway to send an unencrypted message saying their water distillation plant has broken down and they're running short of fresh water. If AF is Midway, the Japanese will intercept that message, and they'll send an encrypted message up their chain saying AF is short of water, confirming that AF is Midway." Nimitz understood immediately. He said, "Do it," and Rochefort sent the order to Midway through secure undersea cable, telling them to broadcast an unencrypted radio message in plain English saying their desalination equipment had failed and they were running short of drinking water. Midway's commander, confused but obedient, sent the message on May 20th, 1942. Then Rochefort and his team waited. They monitored every Japanese frequency. They intercepted every transmission. And 2 days later, on May 22nd, they intercepted a Japanese encrypted message sent from their intelligence station on Wake Island to their headquarters in Tokyo. The message, after Rochefort's team broke it, read, "AF short of water." They had done it. They had tricked the Japanese into confirming that AF was Midway. Rochefort took the intercept straight to Nimitz. He showed him the original fake message from Midway about water shortage. He showed him the Japanese message saying, AF short of water. He said, "Sir, AF is Midway, and the Japanese are coming with everything they have, probably early June. And if we can get our carriers in position before they arrive, we can ambush them." Nimitz believed him. More importantly, Nimitz overruled Washington. He ignored Admiral King's staff, who were still saying the Aleutians were the target. He ordered the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to take position northeast of Midway and wait in ambush. And he did it based entirely on the analysis of one cryptanalyst with an impossible memory who had connected 2 messages 3 months apart and then tricked the enemy into confirming his theory. The Battle of Midway happened exactly as Rochefort predicted. The Japanese fleet arrived at Midway on June 4th, 1942, expecting to surprise and overwhelm a lightly defended island, and then destroy the American carriers when they rushed to defend it. Instead, the American carriers were already there, waiting in ambush, positioned exactly where they needed to be because Rochefort had told them where the enemy was going to be and when they were going to be there. The battle was brutal and chaotic and could have gone either way, but the Americans had the critical advantage. They knew where to look and when to strike. In one 5-minute period, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft and turned them into floating infernos. A 4th carrier was destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the heart of their striking power, along with hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. They never recovered the strategic initiative, and the entire battle happened because Joseph Rochefort remembered a message from February about water supplies at Kwajalein and connected it to a message in May about AF, a connection that shouldn't have been possible to make, but that his brain made automatically, and then because he had the audacity to trick the Japanese into confirming it. This was the ripple effect. This was the piano wire that changed the entire war. Without Rochefort's memory, without his trick, the American carriers would have been positioned to defend the Aleutians. The Japanese would have taken Midway unopposed. They would have established a base 1,300 miles from Hawaii. The war in the Pacific would have lasted years longer and cost tens of thousands more lives. But because one man remembered everything and trusted what his impossible brain was telling him, the battle was won before it started. You would think that after this, after Rochefort proved he was right and Washington was wrong, after he delivered the most important intelligence victory in American history, he would have been celebrated, promoted, given medals and recognition. You would be wrong. The officers in Washington who had disagreed with him, who had insisted AF was the Aleutians, who had been proven catastrophically wrong, they didn't forgive him for being right. They couldn't court-martial him for succeeding, so they did something worse. They quietly sidelined him. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was removed from command of Station Hypo and reassigned to a logistics job, shuffling supplies in San Francisco, as far from code-breaking as they could put him. The official reason was that he needed a rest after the stress of the previous months. The real reason was that he had embarrassed powerful men by being right when they were wrong. And powerful men don't forget embarrassment. Rochefort spent the rest of the war in obscurity, watching other officers take credit for the intelligence work that his team at Hypo had done, watching the code-breaking operation he had built be taken over by Washington bureaucrats who had fought him every step of the way. He never complained publicly. He never wrote a memoir defending himself. He just did his job, whatever job they gave him, and waited for the war to end. When the war finally ended in 1945, Rochefort retired from the Navy quietly, without ceremony, without the recognition that men who had done far less received routinely. He went back to California, worked in private industry, designing oil refinery systems, lived a quiet suburban life, and almost never spoke about the war, or about Midway, or about the impossible thing his brain had done. For decades, the true story of how the Battle of Midway was won remained classified, buried in Navy archives, and Rochefort remained unknown outside a small circle of former intelligence officers who knew what had really happened and who quietly seethed at the injustice of it all. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the Midway intelligence files were finally declassified, that historians began to understand what Rochefort had actually done, and a few of them, digging through the archives, finding the intercepts and the analysis and the trick with the water message, realized that this man had been systematically erased from the history of the battle he had made possible. A campaign began, led by Rochefort's former subordinates at Hypo, and by historians who understood what had been done to him, to get him the recognition he deserved. They petitioned the Navy. They wrote articles. They testified before Congress. The Navy resisted for years because admitting that Rochefort had been treated unjustly meant admitting that senior officers had been wrong and petty and vindictive, and institutions don't like admitting those things. Finally, in 1985, after years of pressure, the Navy agreed to award Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal, the recognition he should have received in 1942. There was just one problem. Joseph Rochefort had died in 1976, 9 years earlier, never knowing that history would eventually vindicate him. The medal was presented to his family in a quiet ceremony at the Pentagon. His daughter accepted it on his behalf. She said later that her father would have appreciated the gesture, but wouldn't have thought it mattered very much, because he hadn't done what he did for medals or recognition. He had done it because it needed to be done, and because he was the only one who could do it, and that was enough. Today, there's a building at the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, named after Joseph Rochefort. There's a display about him at the National Cryptologic Museum. Military intelligence students study his methods. His trick with the water message is taught as a classic example of intelligence tradecraft, how to use deception to confirm analysis when you can't prove it through conventional means. But most people have never heard of him. Most people, if they know the story of Midway at all, know about the dive bomber pilots and the carriers and Admiral Nimitz. But they don't know about the man in the basement who remembered everything and connected two messages and tricked the Japanese into revealing their plans. This is the pattern. This is the theme that runs through all these stories. The radar man who heard shapes, the welder who felt flaws in metal, the mechanic who read oil, the navigator who read clouds, the gunner who felt bullets coming, and now the cryptanalyst who remembered everything. They all had abilities that shouldn't have been possible. They all saw problems that the experts missed. They all broke the rules and trusted themselves when the institutions told them they were wrong. And they all saved lives on a scale that's almost impossible to calculate. Rochefort's memory, his impossible, exhausting curse of a gift memory, saved thousands of American sailors at Midway and shortened the Pacific War by months or years, and prevented the Japanese from establishing an unsinkable aircraft carrier base within striking distance of Hawaii. That's the legacy. Not the medal that came too late. Not the building with his name on it. The legacy is the men who came home because one man remembered a message about water supplies from 3 months ago and had the audacity to trick the enemy into confirming what his brain already knew. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, age 76, quietly, without fanfare, and his obituary in the Los Angeles Times was 4 sentences long and didn't mention Midway or Codebreaking or anything about what he had actually done. But somewhere in the Navy archives, in a classified file that's probably been digitized by now, but still carries the same label it carried in 1942, there's a memo written by Admiral Nimitz 3 days after the Battle of Midway. The memo is addressed to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, and it says, in part, the victory at Midway was made possible by the exceptional work of Station Hypo under Commander Rochefort. His analysis was correct in every particular. His methods were unorthodox but brilliant. This officer's contribution to the war effort cannot be overstated. That memo was ignored for 30 years. But it was true then, and it's true now. Some men see the war. Some men fight the war. And some men remember everything and use that curse as a weapon and save thousands of lives by connecting dots that no one else can see. That's how wars are won. Not always by the people who get the medals, but by the people in the basement who won't stop thinking, who won't stop connecting, who won't stop trusting what their impossible brains are telling them, even when everyone says they're wrong. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, history eventually remembers them anyway.